Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We are delighted to be joined this evening by Aleksandra Urbaniak of Adam Mickiewicz University, who will be delivering a talk entitled Male Homosexuality in the Galician-Portuguese Cantigas de Escárnio e Maldizer in the Light of the Community Norms of Emotional Expression. Aleksandra is a PhD student in the Doctoral School of Languages and Literatures in the discipline of Literary Studies in the Institute of Romance Languages and Literatures at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznán. She also holds from Adam Mickiewicz University a bachelor's degree in Spanish Studies and a master's degree in Italian Studies. She's published a broad variety of papers and book chapters from 2018 to 2023 on subjects such as love sickness in Guido Cavalcanti's These Lyrics, love sickness in Cino de Pistola, or between a literary game and medical science, female old age as an object of reflection, and the comic realistic poetry of medieval Tuscany. In addition, she's also partaken in a number of conferences, such as the 2023 International Symposium Eros, Thinking, Feeling, Writing Love from Classical Antiquity to Early Modernity at New York University, the International Congress on the Study of the Middle Ages at the University of Leeds, also in 2023, and meetings of the Old Romance Literature Specialists Time Waiting Patient in 2022 at the Jagiellonian University in Poland. She's participated in the works of a provincial commission in Poznán during the 46th and 47th Olympics of the French language, and as an ordinary associate in the NUME Association, a research group on the Latin Middle Ages. In 2021, she was awarded the Medal of the Rector of Adam Mickiewicz University for eminent results in the study and remarkable participation in university life. And her main interests include love in old Romance literatures, medieval in particular, ancient and medieval medical treatises and their relationship to medieval love lyrics, or epistemic criticism, and Galician-Portuguese and Italian poetry. Aleksandra, thanks so much for joining us this evening. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation.
Not at all.
Can I start?
Absolutely, please do.
Well, today I am going to talk about the male homosexuality in Galician-Portuguese Cantigas de Escárnio e Maldizer in light of the community norms of emotional expression. Before engaging in the analysis of the representations of intermasculine relationships in Galician-Portuguese satirical poetry, we consider it essential to discuss several terminology questions. First of all, we would like to explain that we apply the term homosexuality intentionally, since we have assumed with other researchers, such as Miguel Ángel Chamocha Cantudo, that it is the beginning of the citation and indispensable historical anachronism, the end of the citation, selected to avoid using the clearly pejorative and veiled notion of sodomy, which, because of its offensive quality, will always appear in quotation marks. At the same time, we do not pretend to argue that in the 13th century, the period that occupies us in the present work, there existed what we now mean by sexual orientation. For the purposes of this paper, we prefer to talk with caution about sexual preferences or sexual dispositions, which, nevertheless, cannot be perceived as simple equivalents of the sexual orientation known in modernity. It is also relevant to clarify that we are not going to differentiate between Cantigas de Escárnio and Cantigas de Maldizer, that is, between an indirect veiled satire and a direct personal one. The decision is motivated not only by the contemporary tendencies postulated among others by Mercedes Brea, but also by the fact that in the Middle Ages, the border separating two mentioned genres was relatively fluid. In the so-called rubrica, the selected texts were classified as Cantigas de Escárnio e Maldizer, that means belonging to a mixed genre. This practice reveals that a rigid distinction postulated in the Arte de Trovar, perhaps from the 14th century, based on the criterion of directness of poetic expression, constituted rather a theoretical ideal. On the other hand, it is worth to highlight that in the above-mentioned rhetorical treatise, with reference to a Cantiga de Escárnio, there appeared a term that is particularly important to us, equivocatio. It is defined as dizer per palavras cobertas que hajam dous entendimentos, to talk through covered words which have two meanings. Considering the complexity of this figure, we would like to focus on the equivocatio based on the polysemy of lexems, the comprehension of which was possible thanks to a common cultural horizon of the audience. This literary technique was frequently used in poems exploring the field of sexuality, especially its area defined by Giuseppe Tavani as field of obscenity, even though these poems, as different contemporary researchers opine, were not necessarily perceived as such in the medieval epoch. Be it as it may, there is no doubt that the equivocatio served to generate ambiguity in the erotic context, so that in a literal reading, a word's meaning was neutral, innocent, while in a covered, figurative interpretation, one could detect a humorous sexual subtext. The aim of this paper is to find several common characteristics of the representations of male homosexualism, as well as to propose possible explanations why a particular mode of representation was selected. The explanations will be based on concepts derived from theory of the norms of emotional expression, namely William Reddy's emotional regime and Barbara Rosenwein's emotional communities. The corpus will be built of satirical cantigas of troubadours who created in the golden age of Galician-Portuguese poetry and, at least in a certain period of their lives, were linked to Alfonso X the Wise, reigning from 1252 to 1284, Martinho Soares, Pero da Ponte, and Pero Garcia Burgaz. We would like to begin with a text written by Pero da Ponte, for whom the topic of male homosexualism is one of the favorite ones. An example of the author's interest in this theme is a poem, Não te superes, queria algeu, 30 superes, today I would like to, whose lyrical subject, however hardly identifiable with the same Pero da Ponte, complains about overtime work for one Dom te superes, who might have been Dom Aparício Pérez, the King Alfonso X official. He would like to stop performing this service, but he is not allowed to leave his master. Dom te superes, queria algeu, ser guardado do trabalho seu, mas não me possa seu jogo quitar. In order to expose his displeasure and irritation caused by the servitude for a long time, at the end of every strophe he repeats, in a little changed form, a rhetorical question. Que demo o fez o tão trabalhador por sempre amigo querer trabalhar? What devil has made him so hard-working that he always wants to work with me? Don Tiso has a great willingness to work with him, whereas for his subordinate a relation of this type has become troublesome, as we can find out from the following verses. De trabalhar me é grão sabor, e o pesar nunca vistes maior. But what kind of work are we talking about? It could seem strange that the text does not specify what exactly the main duties are. The only thing which the poem reveals is a time when he performs his services. Não dormo de noite com favor, que me trabalha sempre. I do not sleep at night with fear because he always works with me. All the translations are mine. Me vê cada noite despertar. He sees me wake up every night. For the purpose of decoding the Pero da Ponte's cantiga, we have to be aware of dual meanings of the lexeme trabalhar and its derivatives, such as the noun trabalho. In Galician-Portuguese poetry, the word trabalhar, to work, constituted the frequent allusion to the sexual act, and especially to the intercourse between two men, suggested in the poem also by the word jogo, game. Only once we discover the secret meaning, we will see that we are dealing with a humorous but clearly condemning satire against male homoerotic desire. Moreover, another lexeme which weighs in favor of the homoerotic reading appears, bâton, stick. Although its basic meaning in this context is difficult to determine, a veiled one refers, without a shadow of doubt, to male genital organs usually described in the cantigas in terms of length. Nonetheless, the finding of a sexual subtext in the troubadour's poetry is not always so easy for us. There are two principal reasons for the difficulty. In numerous cases, we are not able to know the communicative context of the time anymore, and the obscene lexicon has the tendency to vary, especially when it comes to particularly popular topics such as a coitus or intimate body parts. We will realize what interpretation challenge we are facing if we pay attention to one of Peru Garcia Burgal's cantiga, Fel não dias, esticão daqui. Fel não dias, this one who works here, whose enigmatic nature has been emphasized many times. Notwithstanding certain divergences between readings of several fragments, most scholars agree that this text contains an allusion to male homosexuals. In a superficial literal interpretation, the poem recounts how one day Fernão Dias, perhaps Esteban Fernandes de Castro, Alphonse X bailiff, Meirinho Mayor, and a frequent protagonist of the Cantigas de Escárnio and Maldizer, took a journey beyond the sea to the north of Africa in quest for, the beginning of the citation, a good master who could frame precious stones, the end of the citation. Fernão Dias, este cão daqui, foi uma vez daqui a ultramar, e quanto bom mestre pôde achar de castoar pedras. Despite unremitting efforts, he did not manage to meet the man who could frame his precious stone in the knob of a cane. Nunca achou castoador que o soubesse castoar. When finally found somebody who took on the difficult task, he was cheated. The master told him that the sapphire was a forgery and substituted the gem by a semi-precious and less valuable stone, a red tiger's eye, which was, however, the biggest one that he found in the world. E disse-lhe que era desafio destes maus contrafeitos del põe, e meteu-lhe grão de olho de bom, aquele maior que ele no mundo achou. And in depth reading converts an apparently innocent and neutral story about jewels in a mocking and derisive satire on the so-called perfect sodomy, that is, an anal intercourse between men. Considering a wide array of interpretational possibilities of several details, for the purpose of this study, we have decided to opt for an interpretation proposed by Arias Frechedo, which, in our view, most transparently refers to the theme of intermasculine sexual relationships. In the opinion of this researcher, the Cantiga describes in reality various homosexual adventures of Fernán Diaz among Muslims, who since the First Crusade in 1095 have been linked stereotypically in medieval Europe to the misdeed contra naturam. This interpretation is possible thanks to the use of lexical equivocatio based on the word olio, which in the poem refers to a gem as well as to a penis. Notice that despite of a dose of humor, the text humiliates Fernão Dias, given that it describes how his intimate organ, being too small, prevented him from playing an active role in sexual intercourse. Olio, his member stone, was defined as forged, that is bad. At this point, we would like to remind the reader that in the Middle Ages, the passivity during a coitus was expected from women, and because of that, the passive homosexuals were perceived with a kind of misogynist rage, although the homosexuals in general were seen as unmanly and effeminate. Once we know this, we can realize the strength of the analyzed satire, not devoid of political significance, since Fernão Dias maintained public functions, and Peru Garcia Burgal's poem may have implied that he was unable to fulfill his official duties. The ridiculing of people generally known at Alfonso X courts can be detected also in a cantiga, Pero não fui a ultramar, although I have not been beyond the sea, by another troubadour, Martim Soares. The rubrica preceding the poem says, Esta cantiga fez Martim Soares a cavaleiro que era chufador, que dizia que vinha de ultramar. This cantiga was made by Martim Soares for a knight who was a boaster, because was saying to come from beyond the sea. As we can suppose, the audience of that time could identify the mentioned brother, but in fact, for the poet, he is only a pretext to characterize the sexual mores in other lands. The lyrical subject purports to know other parts of the world very well, despite never having been there. He owes his knowledge to the troubadour Sueyruanish, who visited various places and told him about his experiences in a vivid way. In his report of a long journey, different places appear, among others Belfurado, that is Belorade in Spain, situated on the Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James, and Rocamador, which now is in southern France, and was then famous for its sanctuary of Santa Maria. At the beginning, we could have an irresistible impression that the poem contains no sexual allusion, but we must be aware of the fact that some cantigas resorted also to the equivocatio based on toponyms. For this reason, as Carlos Cadion suggests, in an alternative reading, the poem focuses on homosexual relations established by Sueyruanish, since Belfurado acquires the meaning of a nice or happy anus, de anu bonito alegre, while Rocamador has the hidden meaning of a lover of hardness, amante da dureza. If the first case does not require further explanations with reference to the latter, we must add that in Galician-Portuguese poetry, male genitals were often described just in terms of hardness. Also, the rubrica plays with dual meanings. The spelling of oversea, outramar, differs from ultramar in the first verse, suggesting us immediately the right interpretation. Outramar seems to be composed of two words, outro amar, which gives us different loving in quotation marks, obviously different from a natural loving between man and woman. The choice of the form amar instead of amor is not insignificant. In the language of courtly love, the verb amar had the pejorative meaning of a blind and sensual passion, as opposed to the noun amor denoting a noble love. This lexical decision also condemns a homosexual relationship on a linguistic level, the fact which corroborates with social attitudes of that time, since homosexual men were persecuted, especially in and after the 13th century. This phenomenon was linked, among other things, to the uniformization of thinking and political power, and no other European kingdom established more severe laws condemning sodomites than Castilla. All the poets whose texts we have analyzed lived in times of Alfonso X the Wise, therefore had to be acquainted with his legal code, Fuero Real, from the half of the 13th century, which forbade same-sex relations in the following way. Maguel que no se atrevía de hablar en cosa que es muy sin guisa de cuidar, y muy más sin guisa de facera, pero porque mal pecado alguna vez aviene, que un hombre codicia a otro por pecar con él contra natura. Mandamos que cualesquier que sean que tal pecado hagan, que luego de fuer sabido, que ambos a dos sean castrados ante todo el pueblo, y después al tercer día que sean colgados por las piernas hasta que mueran, y nunca dende sean dolidos. Let us note that the word sodomy is absent, which was a frequent legal practice in the Middle Ages, since it was perceived as an unmentionable vice, crimen nefandum, but the expression contra natura constituted its recurrent periphrases in the Middle Ages. Then it was easily comprehensible to everybody. Another interesting fact deserving our attention is the use of the lexem sin pecado in a legal text. We need to know that in spite of an apparently stable division of misdeeds into sins, a religious context, a misdeed morally harmful, and crimes, a legal context, a misdeed socially harmful, exceptions to the mentioned rule existed, and one of them was a sodomy perceived as a public sin dangerous to the whole society. Same-sex sexual relations disturbed the order imposed by God and nature because they did not serve procreation. For this reason, homosexuals fell victim to repression, such as prescribed by Fuero Real, sentencing them to public castration and cruel death by hanging by the feet. Given that The intermasculine sexual relationships were prohibited by Alfonso X Code. In the context of the Crown of Castilla of the 13th century, it is permissible to talk about the existence of an emotional regime. This term has been coined by William Ready, who has defined it as the beginning of the citation, a set of normative emotions in the official rituals, practices, and emotives that express and inculcate them, the end of the citation, established by a political regime. Although Carlos Carrión has put forward a hypothesis that the mentioned law may have not been enforced with its full severity, it does not change the fact that the male homosexuality and the expression of a homoerotic desire were officially forbidden, and the name sodomy seemed so repulsive that it could not be pronounced. With this context, we can state that one of the possible reasons for using the poetic strategy of equivocatio in Galician-Portuguese poetry was nothing but an emotional regime established in Fuero Real. The equivocatio could be treated as a kind of code, especially if we take into consideration the richness of thematical variations in the field of obscenity. However, it is true that such cantigas did not necessarily have to correspond to reality, given the fact that Alfonso X's laws provided penalties even for the injury and insult committed through the cantigas. Moreover, interestingly, it was during the reign of Alfonso X and Denis of Portugal when the majority of texts resorting to the equivocatio were created. Another probable explanation for playing with double meaning in Galician Portuguese satire may lie in the so-called emotional communities, a concept postulated by Barbara Rosenwein, who defines it in the following way. The beginning of the citation. Groups in which people adhere the same norms of emotional expression and value or devalue the same or related emotions. The end of the citation. Since the Galician Portuguese troubadours belonged to a courtly emotional community whose model of love was that of pinamores between man and woman, the description of homosexuality may have been perceived by them, at least to a certain degree, as a thematic and linguistic taboo. The community norms of emotional expressions can, therefore, explain several particular ways of representing male homosexuality in the cantigas. And now I'm going to conclusions. As we have seen, the figure of equivocatio gave the poets an array of possibilities, permitting them to present problems disdained by high culture and to show their literary competence and creativity. In light of a very small segment of Galician Portuguese satirical poetry that we have analyzed, it is possible to draw the conclusion that the language of these poems was not so serious and aggressive as that used in the legal context. The satires were amusing, mocking, sneering, but did not condemn homosexuals in a peremptory way. It is important, since troubadours did not shun from mentioning names of people commonly known in a courtly circle, the fact that made their cantigas seemed to be more rooted in reality. Furthermore, male homosexuality tended to be attributed to Muslims, as indicated in the satires referring to the Arabic lands. With the aim to camouflage sexual content, they also took recourse to the double-meaning toponyms, objects associated with properties of length and hardness, for example, stone, stick, as well as to the descriptions of relationships inspired by the paradigm of courtly love, for example, service and obedience. Thanks to the poet's virtuosity, the satirical cantigas may be perceived as palimpsests admitting two alternative readings, a neutral one, for example, the description of a journey or jewelry, and another erotic sexual one. The veiling of homoerotic and homosexual male desire is particularly relevant if we have in mind that these texts were sung at the court by publicly known authors, more well-known people, and tackled the problem of homosexuality that transgressed the community norms of emotional expression. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. That's absolutely, it's a really fascinating field. I think particularly when we see the political state of male homosexuality in Castile and Galician Portuguese communities, and then comparing that to, say, poetry where it was dealt with in a more satirical and more accepting sort of way. Yeah, it's a really fascinating field, and I'd love to explore it a bit more now. So I'd be curious to know, sort of, firstly, um, in what sort of ways would these can the cantigas be performed, and to what sort of audiences would typically kind of listen to these?
Mhm. To my knowledge, results that mainly it was the elite who was living at the court, so it was not known rather among common people, we can say.
I see, absolutely. And I think that's really interesting that they sort of draw on those ideas of kind of courtly love and obedience, and there's sort of expression found through that. Would you say that that's perhaps a deliberate thing that's kind of used kind of to reflect kind of the realities of course and maybe the lives that these people were living?
Mhm. Yes, and I can say that it was also a certain paradox because
Mhm.
normally we can think that the elite, the people of the court, were not interesting of these themes, but I think that it's a stereotypical approach, and in fact some themes that we can perceive as transgressive or obscene from the today's point of view were not necessarily perceived as such by the medieval court audience.
I see, yeah. I think my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that these sorts of things were much more widely accepted. So it wouldn't have been seen as this kind of shocking thing that people, that would have been, just taboo to say in front of really elite people, but it would have been seen as something that people could genuinely kind of laugh and joke about. And am I right in thinking that that was kind of the aim of a lot of these kind of songs and the way that they presented it?
Mhm. Could you repeat the question?
Oh, right. Yes. So it's quite interesting that this wasn't really seen as a taboo thing. And it was sort of just more seen as something that one could kind of laugh at and can be presented in a kind of satirical way. Yeah. And
Mhm.
yeah.
Yes, I agree. And from my experience of analyzing the medieval texts, results that the authors, the poets, were interested of many things that their thematic field was very extent. For example, also from the contemporary point of view, and
Mhm.
I think that it was not so shocking for the people of the time to talk about these themes, and it was also difficult not to write satires. In fact, the satires could approach different subjects, also the sex, which was not treated as an intimate part of life. We have to remember that the people in the Middle Ages, for example, peasants or the people who not belonged to the elite, were also accustomed to the intercourse in public.
Mhm.
We have to remember, for example, the euphemism to have greenback, which functioned in English, if I remember well, and it had the meaning to have sex
Mhm.
on the
Yeah.
grass.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Absolutely, I see what you mean, and I guess yeah, as it was perhaps more of a kind of public thing in the Middle Ages, and I think as my understanding is, it was discussed a lot more candidly. Then yeah, it sort of didn't have that kind of shock value, I guess, that we kind of associate with it today. And I'd be interested as well, like, do we have any idea about what the church kind of thought about this? Like, did they just kind of see this as just another form of entertainment, or did they have a particular opinion about this particular form of literature and the themes that it explored?
Mhm. Uh, it is worth to start with the reminding that for the Church of the Middle Ages, the courtly love in its sensual, erotic dimension, also the heterosexual love between men and women, was perceived as forbidden in a certain sense. And I think that the Cantigas, who used the obscene lexicon, who talked about the intimate parts of body and about the homosexualism, had to be perceived as worse, as worse than the heterosexual, not satirical poems. So I think that it had to be criticated.
See, absolutely, absolutely. Interesting stuff. Yeah, and moving on perhaps to the methodology of actually kind of doing this kind of research. What do you find are the opportunities that these sources give, and what do you think are the challenges as well of kind of working with this kind of material?
Mm. I think that first of all, it's important to say about the interdisciplinary character of such a research. And I think that the interdisciplinarity can be at the same time the opportunity, the advantage, but also the problem. The problem
Mhm.
because of the methodological questions, because of course we have literary texts. We have some informations about the poet's biography, lives, some geographical indications where they lived, etc. But to my knowledge, results that we don't have a direct proofs to be able to connect the legal code for real and the poetic creation written by these poets. So it's always a hypothesis, a manner of interpreting these texts in a vaster, broader context of the epoch. It is also relevant to include a historical point of view, also sociological one, because we are talking about the approach of the society of the epoch to the themes perceived as taboo, also, for example, in a legal context. And it is also difficult from my point of view to connect in some way the approach of the creators of the legal context where we can find damnation, in fact, of the homosexual relationships in a very direct, severe way, and more free and mocking, sneering approach of the poets.
Hmm. See, yeah, 'cause I guess it can be quite difficult to kind of, these are two obviously very different types of sources that approach the same topic in wildly different ways. And I can appreciate that, yeah, I imagine it can be quite difficult to kind of sort of dig down and see if you can find like sort of, common themes between, say, one text that's very direct but very scathing, and then one that's maybe more accepting, but it works a lot more with things like double meanings and kind of hiding things and using it to allude to other things as well. Yeah. And yeah, do you think there are sort of any ways to draw those connections, or do you think that that's still something that's sort of quite difficult to get those sources to kind of talk to each other?
I think that it's rather a hypothesis, and as I mentioned, it's not my main area of research, but I think that the interdisciplinary research always take the risk to connect some things which not necessarily have to be connected in the medieval epoch. And the other problem is the terminology. Because, as I've mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, in fact, we don't have terminology to use, and we have to recourse to contemporary terms or terms which exist from the 19th century, as homosexualism, for example. And from this point of view, we don't have tools to approach these texts, because we have to take risk of recursing to the historical anachronism, which is comprehensible in this context.
Yeah, definitely. And I can imagine that it's all too easy to kind of read modern ideas into a kind of medieval manuscript. With these sorts of ideas that would have a very different sort of understanding that we would today. Yeah, and I imagine that's interesting, but I imagine quite certainly one of the sort of major challenges of exploring this. And out of curiosity, is this a fairly new field that's being explored at the minute, or have there kind of been scholars that have previously looked at this particular subject in this particular context?
In this particular context of the legal codes or the concepts of emotional regime or emotional communities, I haven't found such a research, but of course I have inspired by the works of some other researchers who were interested, for example, by the legal codes, and their studies helped me a lot to understand the political and legal context of the epoch, to have simply a point where to start to dig to make this kind of research.
Yeah, definitely. And forgive me, this might be me reading into things a bit here, but am I right in thinking that there's been an assumption with this form of poetry that kind of themes of male homosexuality weren't really there before? Or is it something that we've kind of known about but just haven't really explored in any real depth?
I think that this theme was explored. The homosexualism have been demonstrated in the Cantigas de Escárnio in Maldizer, and also the field of obscenity, the vulgar lexicon was treated. And also the manners of perceiving such vocabulary, the question if it was obscene or not, and we can't solutionate this problem so far, because it's always a hypothesis, and it is important to remember it. But the study of the homosexuality in Galician-Portuguese Cantigas in the context of the epoch of the Fuero Real of Alfonso X hasn't been studied so far, as I know.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So if I've understood this correctly, it's something that's kind of been explored in lots of other contexts, so perhaps in, say, obscenity and things like that. But it's not really something that's kind of been read into with poetry. Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And really good that we've kind of been able to begin to explore this with this kind of research. And out of interest, when it comes to kind of drawing out themes of male homosexuality, obviously some things I can imagine are fairly obvious, like for example the double entendre with Olo, for example, or references to things like, say, rods or kind of service. But have you ever found that there are some instances where you suspect there might be an equivocation or a double meaning, but it doesn't, but you can't quite tell for certain? Is there any sort of ambiguity, as it were?
Mm, mhm. I haven't found so far such examples because I have concentrated on the field of sexuality, and I know that the most of Cantigas were concentrated on the field of sexuality.
Hmm. I see. So
But
that.
also, it's also very interesting that not necessarily had to be a homosexual love, because there are also some equivocators which refer simply to the heterosexual love, and it is mentioned in the monography by Simone Marcenaro, who occupied by the theme of equivocatio in the Cantigas de Escárnio and Maldizer.
I see. Interesting. Interesting. Then moving back to the Cantigas themselves, I'm quite curious. It seems to me it's perhaps a coincidence that sort of these legal codes that are quite explicitly homophobic and persecuting queer people come up at what appears to be sort of a similar time to some of the authors that we've discussed and some of their works. Yeah, just wondering. Again, I might be sort of reading into this here, but was there maybe a link between kind of the outlawing of same-sex relations and this becoming a prominent theme in the Cantigas? Or was that just kind of a passing coincidence and instead had been kind of a prominent theme beforehand?
Mm, I think that we can observe the connection of this type between
Mhm.
the creation of the legal codex, which were homophobic and condemned the sodomites, and the creation of Galician-Portuguese Cantigas, because, as some researchers claim, the most of the satirical cantigas of this type were created during the reign of Alfonso X, who condemned this type of relationships, of homosexual relationships. And it is also worth to mention in this context, he's the most important and widely known in the medieval Europe legal code, Siete Partidas, which also mentions the sodomy and says that the people who are prone to it, who who dare to express their homosexual desire, should be condemned to death. But in this case, it is written in less severe way, in this meaning that it doesn't specify a type of death. But at the same time, we have to have in mind that not only Alfonso X was so cruel uh, toward the homosexual, because, for example, in the medieval Bologna or Siena, we can also find such cruel examples. For example, in Bologna, the homosexual man should be condemned to death by burnt alive, or in Siena, we are also talking about the hanging by the penis to humiliate such a victim.
Hmm. Yeah, dreadful stuff. Absolutely. Yeah, indeed. It's yeah, I suppose it's an unfortunate reality of the period that that was sort of something that was happening in many different parts of Europe. Um, and I'd be interested, kind of off the back of that. I appreciate this is perhaps going a little bit beyond the kind of geographical scope of this particular paper. But do you find this kind of happening in other areas, like say Bologna, for example, where these kind of quite repressive laws were passed, and then we kind of see a literary culture kind of spring up in parallel with it? or is this something that's quite specific to the Galician-Portuguese context?
Mhm. I think that it's quite specific to the Galician-Portuguese context, but I have also in mind some examples from the Italian medieval poetry, the so-called poesia comico-realistica of Tuscany, where some poets such as Rustico di Pippo, known also as Rustico Pippi, also was interested in the homosexualism.
Mhm.
And it was also a satirical kind of poetry, so we can find some parallels. And moreover, it is worth to emphasize that one of the Rustico di Filippo friend, Brunetto Latini, was sent as an ambassador to the court of Alfonso X. To negotiate in the case of the Battle of Montaperti. So we have also a historical proof of the connection between the satirical poetry of Toscan and the Galician Portuguese ones. So maybe also the literary themes and inspirations could transgress the borders of the countries.
See, yeah, I think that could be a really interesting field to look into, perhaps at some point, and just kind of see the connections between the two, especially if poets and diplomats from kind of each culture were kind of speaking with one another. I am intrigued though. Did Alfonso X ever enjoy any of these cantigas? Do we know for certain, or is that just something that we can only speculate on?
I don't know it, but I think that it could be fascinating to discover it. But I think that Alfonso X was a very a very open monarch, and he had a very broad field of interests. So maybe he was interested by this cantigas, and he had to know that this type of texts were sung by the poets of the Portugal, because he forbade in one of his codes to use the injury and insult in such type of text. So I think that that he had to know maybe some of them.
Right, I see. Because obviously, he wouldn't have passed a law like that, like if he wasn't aware that this was kind of going on, and presumably was fairly popular amongst some of his courtiers and things.
Yes, and if I can add it, because I have also it in mind now, I remember one of the poems of Alfonso X, which was also obscene and condemning, and it was about an old woman who was described as repulsive, as very ugly, etc. So he paradoxically used the injury and insult, which he condemned officially.
See.
It's very strange, but also is fascinated in this context. So maybe privately he liked Cantigas de Escárnio and Maldizer, but as a serious monarch, he had to condemn them. I'm joking now, but
Yeah, possibly. But I see what you mean. It's really interesting that like he would use that sort of medium as like sort of personal satisfaction, and yet he seemed to take a stand against them at certain points. And I think that's a really fascinating kind of dichotomy, as you say. And it's amusing to see, like, maybe he did actually enjoy them, but he just sort of felt that he had to kind of put on a show and say, no, this we can't have any of this. Oh, good stuff. Yeah, and out of interest, I appreciate that most of the authors that we've spoken about today are from the 13th century. But do we find that this tradition continues past the 1200s into later centuries, or does it tend to sort of die out after that?
So far, I haven't occupied by the developing of the Galician-Portuguese Cantigas, but we have to remember that in fact, in the 14th century, the Portuguese poetry of this type has a kind of crisis. In fact, the most known and the most eminent poets were created in the period of the 12th and the 13th century.
I see. So that was kind of the literary kind of high period, as it were,
Yes,
when kind of
because
most of this stuff.
yes, in fact, because it is also connected to the so-called trovadorismo. So the developing of the poetry of troubadours, and of course the troubadours had to have their mecenates, as for example Alfonso X.
I see. Yes. Ah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that kind of yeah, it was kind of produced by that, and particularly again from like people like Alfonso that were kind of, I presume, kind of patronizing these individuals, but also having to take a stance at the same time.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was also a challenge.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I appreciate we've kind of already sort of spoken about the reception of this and the fact that, people perhaps wouldn't have been as shocked as we would expect they would have been. But I suppose I'm quite interested. I seem to recall, sort of certainly from, say Renaissance Italy, for example, there was an expectation that, say, society ladies couldn't laugh at double entendres in plays and things like that. And I'd be interested to know, like, do we have any idea about like how people were expected to react to this? Were there certain kind of rules or expectations around kind of responses to these plays? I think it's interesting that we've seen, for example, in the case of Alfonso, that, private, again, speculating, but privately, he may have enjoyed them, but he suppose he had to put on this public face of saying, I disapprove of these. These are, presumably obscene and go against sort of my moral values and things. So yeah, was there anything like that? Or were people just kind of free to receive them as they took them, really?
Unfortunately, so far I haven't found the indications in which way the Cantigas de Escárnio Maldizer about the homosexuality could be perceived by the audience of the time. And in the fragment of the Acte de Trovar, which I've read, I haven't found any proof for that. But I think that the question of the reception of the perceiving of these texts could also be complex. And for example, on the one hand, for the people of the time, the Cantigas could be seen as obscene, as the texts who talk about the taboo themes which could be forbidden. But on the other hand, maybe from the personal point of view, they could enjoy them. And it was a satire that had to be amusing. And maybe it also was a satire which expressed a veiled desire. Maybe also the audience could identify with them in some way, because we have to remember that the the distinction between homosexuality and heterosexuality is a modern one. So maybe it's my supposition in the Middle Ages, the borders between them were more fluid, even though the church and the monarchs and the law officially condemned the homosexuality. But in fact, we don't have the term for that. And the sodomy was, as Michel Foucault recalls, a term which was referring to different forbidden acts. And as he says, it was also citating utterly confused category. So, yes.
See, yeah. And I guess that's really important as well. Just that idea that it might have expressed something, like a desired love or like a veiled desire. And I totally get what you mean as well about how the kind of our modern distinction between heterosexuality and homosexuality wasn't maybe that sort of the same in the Middle Ages, and perhaps there was more of a kind of intersectionality between the two. So yeah, and I think that's really interesting. Yeah, and again, we might be sort of speculating a little bit here, but just on the theme of veiled desires, as I suppose inevitably there would have been sort of queer members of the kind of courts of Alfonso X, regardless of if they were kind of out or not. Do you think that there's any indication that people might have kind of found identity, or they could have seen themselves kind of in some of these kind of themes? Or is that not really something that tends to come out?
It's difficult to answer it
Yeah.
now. Mhm. I think that maybe they could come out, maybe in the presence of some intimate friends, or in a private sphere, in a private life, we can say, but I think it was rather impossible to do it in a public context because it was dangerous.
Oh, of course, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, okay, well, I understand that. Yeah. And do you sort of do you get the impression that and again, this might be me possibly reading into something here, but with these kind of expressions of homosexuality in the Cantigas, are they more of a kind of satirical thing, or is it something where perhaps, somebody listening to it could maybe kind of, see characters or see themes that they could perhaps privately identify with as they kind of heard the song being played out?
Mhm. Mm, I think that first of all, it was a satirical kind of text, but
Mhm.
I see, for example, in this text something personally. Maybe it's only my impression,
Mhm.
my supposition, but I think that maybe here the poet also, as some researchers claim, that it's a lyrical subject hardly identifiable with Pedro da Ponte. Maybe, at least to a certain degree, it's identifiable. Maybe in this meaning that he could have a homosexual desire impossible to express, and the only legal, socially acceptable way of expressing it was through satire. Maybe the satires served also to express the homosexual desire in a safe, acceptable way. Maybe it is also possible to perceive them as such.
Yeah, see, that's interesting. And I appreciate that it's, of course, all just kind of speculation at this point. But
Yes, yes.
yeah, and yes, absolutely. But yeah, I think I suppose it's fascinating just to sort of it's something that I was just kind of intrigued by just kind of hearing those particular themes as they were presented. Yeah, and I suppose starting to kind of round off the talk, are there any particular areas in this kind of study? Is there anything in the sources that we don't know about yet that you'd like to explore in more depth?
Hmm. I have to occupy more by this subject to be able to answer this question. But now I think that it is always something to discover, something that we don't know and we'll never know. For example, from the statistics results that we contemporary know only 10% of the medieval texts, 10%, and the other simply is gone, and maybe we'll never discover them. So maybe some satires written by homosexual men existed and we don't know them.
Absolutely, quite possibly. And it's, as I say, it's a great pity that we've lost so much of that kind of literature.
And in such a case, if the satires could be written by homosexual men, I think that it is possible to perceive a homosexual satire as a way to emphasize the social problem of homophobia, of the condemning of homosexuals and of marginating them from the public life. And it can be also, we can say, the other voice in this public debate.
Absolutely. I think that'd be really fascinating to drill down to if we ever had the opportunity, just to kind of see, like, from the perspective of, say, like a gay man writing this, sort of, what their response would be to, I can imagine, this very hostile kind of public environment that they would have been faced with. I suppose kind of coupled with the fact that, their identity was kind of being explored in this way in these kind of songs that were being kind of sung about the courts for kind of elites. Yeah, I think that'd be fascinating to kind of look into. And I suppose my final question would be that if anyone would be interested to learn more about this topic, where would be the best places to kind of read about this or learn more?
First of all, I could recommend, I'm going to my bibliography, I could recommend the website Cantigas Medievais Galego-Portuguesas, which contains also some critical notes with the translation into contemporary Portuguese, and also some commentary, which enable to contextualize these texts. And maybe also the classical book of John Boswell, Christianity, Social Tolerance and Homosexuality. It's a monography which can offer us a very wide point of view on the social imagination of homosexual individuals, of their persecution, and maybe also El crimen y pecado contra natura o historia de una intolerancia de Miguel Ángel Chamocho Cantudo, which I have mentioned at the beginning of my paper, because it's the book which also concentrates on the persecutions, of the exclusion of the homosexuals, and also the title of this book seems to me very significant from this point of view, the history of the intolerance. And of course, we have also some texts, for example, here the dissertation as relações sexoafetivas intermasculinas e interfemininas no trovadorismo galego, and it's a work which concentrates on the problem of the sexual relationships and also on the homosexual desire in between men and women, because we have also a perspective of of women, at least in the text.
Mhm. Fantastic. All good stuff. Brilliant. Well, I'm afraid that brings us to the end of our discussion this evening. Pity as well, as I think there's so many kind of other fascinating areas that we could explore. But just to say, Aleksandra, thanks so much for joining us this evening. This has been a really fascinating discussion. Thanks so much to everybody at home for watching, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode. Thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
You too.